Last week, 56 men in Philadelphia created a new nation with the stroke of a feathered pen. This week, the contest to keep that nation begins in earnest. With the brothers Howe and the might of the British Empire arriving in full force on Staten Island, the fight for survival is no longer academic. It's a desperate, chaotic struggle in the public square, the diplomatic posturing, and the bloody backcountry. This is the week that will see how the fledgling nation responds when it's challenged on what is now its home soil. This is the revolution. On July 8th, the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence took place in Philadelphia. Summoned by the tolling of the city's bells, including one particular famous cracked bell you may have heard of, a crowd of merchants, sailors, soldiers, and local families gathered in the State House yard. At noon, Colonel John Nixon read the document aloud to the crowd. The reaction was a swell of celebratory cheers, with the crowd shouting "Huzzah!" and the tearing down of King George's coat of arms from the nearby State House, which was dragged to the Commons and burned in a bonfire. But among those listening were untold numbers of quiet Tories. Historians estimate as much as 20% of the population of the 13 colonies were loyal to the Crown, and that might have been even higher in Quaker Pennsylvania. For them, Congress's words weren't the birth of a new nation, they were the start of a civil war. Overnight, neutrality became impossible. Loyalist citizens would need to start taking stock of their options, considering their futures, and quietly noting who cheered and who stayed silent. By contrast, for zealous patriots getting their first taste of freedom, things were just getting started. General Washington received a copy of the Declaration from the Continental Congress on July 9th, and hoping the document would steel his raw recruits for the coming onslaught, ordered his troops to assemble at 6 p.m. that evening. The troops gathered at the Commons, the site of modern-day City Hall Park, and formed hollow squares where the officers could clearly read the declaration to their commands. Washington's general orders on July 9th state his hope that the reading would serve a fresh incentive to every officer and soldier to act with fidelity and courage, as knowing that now the peace and safety of his country depends, under God, solely on the success of our arms. Well, it certainly had its intended effect, because after the reading, a frenzied mob of Continental soldiers, sailors, Sons of Liberty, and local citizens marched down Broadway to Bowling Green Park in Lower Manhattan, home to an ostentatious 2-ton gilded lead equestrian statue of King George III. Erected in 1770, the monument depicted the king on horseback, clad in Roman imperial garb, mimicking the classic equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, elevated on a 15-foot tall marble pedestal. The crowd, armed with axes, hammers, and ropes, stormed the iron fence surrounding the park. They scaled the pedestal, slung ropes around the horse and rider, and violently hauled the massive structure to the ground. Once down, the act turned into an angry, chaotic desecration. They decapitated the statue, battered the body to pieces, and dragged the fragments through the streets. This impromptu, patriotic demonstration gave birth to possibly the greatest mystery of the Revolutionary War. What happened to King George's head? Primary records from both American and British sources confirmed that the severed head was kept aside by American troops who intended to put it on a spike, obviously. However, local Tories managed to steal the head from the American camp and buried it for safekeeping, eventually delivering it to British Captain John Montresor. It was subsequently smuggled back to England, where exiled Loyalist former governor of Massachusetts Thomas Hutchison recorded seeing the gilt head at the London home of Lord and Lady Townshend in November 1777. It hasn't been seen since. But as we all know, that's our head, England. Give it back. As for the rest of the statue, because the Continental Army was short on bullets and New York was highly vulnerable to British military actions, the bulk of the lead was sent to Litchfield, Connecticut, the hometown of General Oliver Wolcott, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Detailed surviving ledger records kept by Wolcott document the exact count of bullets cast by the local community, mostly women, children, and patriotic residents, which totaled exactly 42,088 musket balls. The next time the king saw one of his loyal subjects, he'd be flying past him on a battlefield. The following day, Washington issued a stern reprimand in his general orders, criticizing the riotous behavior and stating that such actions should be left to the proper authority. But I like to think that secretly this was the exact reaction he was hoping for, minus all the rioting. But while the Patriots are flaunting their newly found independence in the streets, the British fleet is already probing for weakness. On the 10th, the Redcoat force attempts to land at Elizabethtown, New Jersey, but is forced back. This will be the first of many skirmishes around the town over the course of the war. On July 12th, the fleet tried a test of American coastal defenses. At 3 p.m., the 44-gun HMS Phoenix and 20-gun HMS Rose caught a perfect tide and wind, surging up the Hudson River and running a gauntlet of American coastal batteries, shelling the New York defenses while taking virtually zero damage. The ships broke through to Haverstraw Bay and anchored near Tarrytown. For weeks, they launched aggressive hit-and-run raids, disrupting Patriot supply lines and terrorizing local militias. The psychological blow was devastating. In just one afternoon, the British took control of the Hudson River, proved America's coastal defenses were useless, and sent a wave of panic through the local population and Continental Army. Also on the 12th, Admiral Lord Richard Howe arrived aboard his flagship HMS Eagle, joining his brother General William Howe. The admiral would direct the fleet while his younger brother commanded forces on the ground. Under cover of this naval pressure, the brothers Howe attempted to open negotiations using their authority as the King's Peace Commissioners. On July 14th, a British lieutenant sailed toward Lower Manhattan under a flag of truce, carrying a letter from Lord Howe addressed to George Washington, Esquire. Washington's officers, Joseph Reed and Samuel Webb, met the lieutenant's boat in the harbor. Upon seeing the address, Reed refused to accept it, flatly stating there was no one in the Army by that title. Now, this might seem like a silly ego-measuring contest to us here in the future, but to the British, using Washington's official military title would recognize the legitimacy of the Continental Congress. To Washington, accepting a civilian address meant conceding that he was merely a rebel subject, liable for treason, rather than the commander of a sovereign nation's army. If the first battle was one of words, Washington couldn't start backing down now. On July 9th, the revolution in Virginia reached a decisive climax at Gwynn's Island. For months, the ousted royal governor, Lord Dunmore, had maintained a floating headquarters off the coast, anchored alongside a desperate coalition of loyalists and the Ethiopian Regiment, a unit of escaped enslaved men promised freedom in exchange for service to the crown. By July, a devastating smallpox epidemic had ravaged Dunmore's command. Sensing an opportunity, Virginia militia under Brigadier General Andrew Lewis hauled artillery to the shoreline and opened a devastating bombardment. The opening salvo battered Dunmore's flagship, wounding the governor's leg with flying wooden splinters. Under heavy fire, Dunmore ordered an immediate evacuation. He spent a few weeks raiding the Potomac before finally burning his infected ships and sailing north to New York in August, ending the last vestige of royal governance in the Old Dominion. 6 days later, on July 15th, the violence shifted to the western frontier of South Carolina. At Lindley's Fort, a crude civilian stockade in the 96th District, the backcountry erupted. A combined force of about 190 Cherokee warriors and loyalists, many painted and disguised as Cherokee warriors, launched a dawn attack on the fort. The defenders were about 150 local Patriot militia and civilian families who had taken refuge inside the stockade. The battle was personal. The combatants were neighbors, fighting a localized civil war over land, allegiance, and survival. Despite being outnumbered, the garrison repelled the assault and sortied out, capturing several loyalist attackers. While the frontier was defined by sudden violence, the northern theater was defined by a slow, agonizing exhaustion. In the second week of July, on the rugged, heavily forested cliffs of Mount Independence on Lake Champlain, the broken remnants of the failed American invasion of Canada were attempting to dig in. For these men, there was no battlefield glory, only pestilence and hunger. Out of a force of roughly 6,000 soldiers, more than half were incapacitated by smallpox, dysentery, and typhus. The camp at nearby Crown Point had become a literal graveyard. Following a Council of War's decision the previous week to abandon the site, commanders Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold were now moving the surviving healthy troops across the lake to fortify the high ground on the mount. The labor was backbreaking. In the oppressive mid-July heat, starving skeletal soldiers cleared dense timber, hauled heavy logs up steep rocky slopes, and threw up defensive breastworks in the mud. They worked alongside the constant stench of sickness and death, burying their comrades by the dozens in shallow, unmarked graves. The struggle at Mount Independence was a sobering reminder of the true cost of the July declarations. The young republic was not just fighting the British Empire. It was fighting starvation, disease, and the sheer logistical impossibility of keeping an army alive in the wilderness. Next week, a different kind of weapon arrives in New York Harbor, an offer of royal pardon. To some, it looks like a lifeline. To others, a trap. In the days ahead, a high-stakes meeting between George Washington and a British emissary will force both sides to show their cards. Meanwhile, the news that diplomacy has failed travels fast, pushing the exhausted soldiers on Lake Champlain to brace for a long-term siege and igniting a fierce retaliatory campaign across the southern backcountry. By next week, the illusion of a peaceful off-ramp is gone, leaving the young nation to face the full weight of an empire. We'll see you then. History's moving fast, and we're going to cover it all. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single update as these events reach their 250th anniversary. We'll see you next week.